without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Michael.
So I'm going to talk today, as Sam said, on 5 ways you can't simulate the human element. For a bit of context there, I'm someone who's done a very heavy amount of automation, and I'll speak actually, I'll jump into my background. Great. So I'm currently the global head of security operations at BugCrowd. Essentially, I manage the triage team and a few other activities related to that. Not so long ago, I was a penetration tester for NCC Group and also a member of the crowd in the top 50. And part of how I've managed to achieve that ranking is through a heavy use of automation. So a large component of what I'm going to be speaking about today is me coming from the angle of knowing the problem from trying to solve it as well. So my theme and take throughout this talk is essentially going to be the problems that I think not necessarily can't be solved, but which aren't solved today. And some of the impacts that kind of stem from that, and the importance of still having someone who's a hacker looking and reviewing content. So, on that note, essentially the crux of the problem is not just systemic to recon, but AI in general. We're in the age where we understand the problem, we understand how to solve it, the pieces to get there, but we're not yet at the destination. And so, consistently throughout this, bearing that in mind, there'll be ways that people probably see some of this content, they're like, oh, well, this can be solved by this. They can be solved, but they're not in the common vernacular yet. So although some of these problems might have been solved or could be solved in an independent fashion, they're not solved in enough of a format yet that it's common across existing tooling. And there's no tooling, I believe, in the market today that properly solves all of these problems, even if there are some that solve 1 or 2 of them. So essentially, to hit on that, the why, creativity is always the big driver and the big winner. We are pushing into the world where we're talking about having creative software using artificial intelligence and machine learning. Again, we're not quite at that point where it can simulate what a human being can do. There's always going to be that element of someone who sees something can react, and they don't need to wait for a learning curve. They don't need to wait for an adjustment to be made. They just understand the problem and they can solve it, or they can think down the problem to solve in a very direct fashion. And this kind of causes a problem in security because we are in a consistently changing state. If you have an organization and you create a data source and you run a tool at it today, you're making 2 assumptions. 1, that your data source is complete, and 2, that it'll remain complete, that there's not going to be any edge cases that arrive. And for anyone that's worked in a company, I'm sure you're well aware, there's always going to be an element in the business that's shifting, that's changing, that's not within scope. This could be as simple as a marketing campaign that's set up for a short duration that was done outside of IT, or it could be another business unit that had a need and went externally to a contractor and delivered it. Or even, you buy a company since you've created your initial data source and that's been missed to be ingested properly. And so you end up with all these weird cases that no matter how good your data is at the point of starting, even if software was a complete focus on the problem, it wouldn't be able to solve it moving forward. It would only be able to solve it for the current state. And the kind of expanding problem on that is that there's so many points of contact in a business that I don't think anyone today can truly say, hey, we've got every asset in our catalog, we've got everything tracked. There's always new ways to look at things and always new problems to solve that expand upon that data, and we're not really good at doing asset management as an industry, and that's extending well beyond security, IT in general. Asset management is one of the key problems that businesses are consistently trying to improve upon because we can't consider ourselves in a solved state, and I don't know if we ever will completely get there. So, again, like human ingenuity always wins here. If you're in a team that you've got someone that's particularly good at recon, you probably solve this problem much better than other organizations do. You're not relying on an external party to map your recon. You can continually evolve, continually improve. And so your signal to noise is probably significantly improved than a company that's going to an external vendor that doesn't understand the business, gives you everything that, then you are getting a bit of a dirtier data set that needs to be cleaned up. And so it doesn't matter how good the process is having someone within the fold who understands the business, understands the problem, is always going to be that significant jump, because they can get straight to the point, straight to the signal. And so on that note, we'll go into 5 problems that we've identified that, personally I feel elaborate well on why this will remain a problem at least for the next 10 years. So the first one is scope. Any software that you deploy needs to be pointed at scope for a number of business reasons. Essentially, you don't want to test something that's not your own. You don't have remit to do it, and you may not legally be able to do that. And the defining difference there, that human ingenuity factor comes into play again. You can give, I won't pick on any software in general, but say you've got a popular security scanning suite, you're going to have to tell it what scope to test on. It's not going to make any assumptions. It can't safely do so. There are products that can do this, but they don't solve other problems that company will have solved because they focus so heavily on the testing component. There's, a human being can look at something and go, okay, yes, that's ours. That's got our branding, that's got our problem solved. Software today, I don't believe that we've hit that point where all software can look at a website and say, yes, this is the company's site, or no, this isn't, without some sort of rules being provided. Where a human being has that ingenuity element that we were touching on, they can look at they can see a company statement, a company branding, colors, fave icons, or something that kind of indicates it back, which allows, more expansion of scope, and it allows them to get a deeper level of understanding of the attack surface that you're looking at. And then tailoring tactics to the organization kind of expands on this problem. If you're in an organization that, say, runs an annual event or an annual marketing campaign, and you set up a new website for it, which isn't uncommon, a human being who's trying to understand your organization can hit on this point. They'll be looking at things like LinkedIn and Twitter and different marketing portals, and they'll go, okay, every year they run this, and it's in this kind of format, and they can bring that into their scope and their understanding, where internally you may have no visibility on that. And these create additional risk points, because those websites also then have to get decommissioned at some point. And if it's not within the remit of the security team or the IT team, that decommissioning process can cause a problem. So we see that very often. For anyone who's working in security, you'll be well familiar with subdomain takeovers. And part of the reason that subdomain takeovers are so prevalent is that the teams that are standing up domains and the teams that are deploying them are usually disconnected and not talking. And so, a short-term campaign arrives and it's set up and it's then decommissioned, leaving that subdomain or potentially that top-level domain in a vulnerable state. And it's a problem that software doesn't yet identify, or at least not all software identifies, because it's reliant on having a full understanding of your scope. And the ones that do identify it, again, tend to do so by you importing all of the scope that you know of and all of the assets, and it's assuming that you've got that full coverage. So it brings us back to the original point 1. The software is only as good as the scope that you provide it, where a hacker's continually able to expand upon it. Or a human being, someone in the organization potentially. And so the other kind of expansion on that is that even if you were to provide scope, software needs to know when something's wrong. And it needs to have some sort of guiding point on that. And often a human being is much more readily able to connect with, hey, like the corporate Twitter account has changed to something that's not ours. Someone's compromised this and it's going to someone independent, or the branding on the front page changes. Natural language processing would need to be something looking at that to go, oh, it's off. You can have someone in an organization pick up something like that much more readily than software can today. And a pretty pertinent example of that, so I've done a lot of external engagements where I've been asked to map the entire perimeter of an organization and essentially provide all of those assets and things that I think are the most risky. So one that I found was a weed dispensary sitting in a major corporation. So this company in no way was in this space, and it was an immediate point out to me that they'd had a subdomain takeover performed over the asset, or a compromised asset, because it had this content hosted there. And so that's something where, it would have been a short-term website stood up for, in this case, it looks like it was set up for a team offsite, had been decommissioned and then left in a state that was vulnerable. And even though this team definitely would have had a defensive team, they were a stock exchange listed top tier company. This is not something that software is going to look at and say, hey, this isn't right, because to a lot of the products on the market today, they're not looking into the types of content, whether it matches your brand or it's off your brand. They're typically looking at things outside of impact and look at things in a vulnerability state. So the defining point is that, this is a high impact, a high PR risk, but because it doesn't tie back to a technical vulnerability, it's not going to have a coverage point where a human being can look at this and go, hey, like this is not right, this is not something that I feel comfortable with, and send that over to a defensive team. Or again, a defensive team that has had that full mapping of scope might have been able to pick this up by seeing that the record changed or the content's changed if they're doing that kind of monitoring. But it relies again on having that scope being mapped in the first place. If you don't have, like the team offsite in this example may have been set up completely independent to the security team, or likely was set up independent to the security team, and so there's no feed over to any sort of ingesting or logs to then allow it to be tracked, unless they're completely ingesting the zone file, which is a pretty rare case today. And so it's also then contextualizing of tests. So anyone who's done any sort of automated scanning knows that they're filled with a very high degree of false positives, a very high signal to noise problem. And a lot of this comes down to the heuristics and the way that they're testing have to be considered from the approach that it could be run on any business. If you're designing that software, it's not being designed for your business, it's being designed for whoever their customer base is. And with that comes two problems. One is that they have to take a very low risk approach. They're assuming you're running it in production because they have to. And they're also going to be taking a stance that, there's certain bug classes that although they can be safely exploited, they need to find a universal way to do that. So as a point of example, web cache poisoning is something that can be quite a risky bug class to test in production. But if you're an experienced researcher, you can do that in a safe means. And for that reason, you don't currently, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, but I don't believe there's any scanners on the market that detect it today. But then, speaking as someone who works in bug crowd triage, it's one of our most common vulnerabilities for that reason, that a lot of hackers know how to test for it, and a lot of hackers bring it to us, and a lot of defensive teams don't have the means to pick it up because they're relying on software to do so. And so, being able to contextualize and have someone who's looking at things from an ingenuity point of view allows both better demonstration of impact as well as the safety of approach. So let's take XSS as an example. A lot of the products that will test for XSS simply give you a proof of concept that shows an alert 1. It's showing you, hey, here's an alert 1 box, there's XSS here. Someone who's creative and can look at your asset can build a payload around your business that could do an account takeover or do a page redress, or something that you as an internal person can take to get funding, to get the means to remediate the issue quicker, because you can put it in front of a non-technical person and say, hey, this link, if sent to someone, will take over their account, as opposed to the lower key software approach where the discussion instead is, hey, this link will pop an alert box, but we believe it can take over an account. It creates a whole different dialogue and a whole different means of securing budget and locking down what you need as a business, simply because the way these approaches have to be taken is that agnostic view of what they're testing against. And then the other point to kind of expand on that, and this comes back to web cache deception again, is the agility and speed in new tools and techniques. If a new CVE drops tomorrow, you will see hackers are going to be exploiting it as soon as they have a working proof of concept. Software, by its very nature, has a production life cycle and a testing life cycle. In referring back to the previous point, they need to find a way to safely test it in production before they can push this out. They need to heavily test that before they push it out. And so the time to market of an individual in terms of a testing approach of something new is significantly shortened than the time to market for a product. and I guess that one of the principal examples there is subdomain takeovers. Very popular, very key tools that are pushed and used in almost every pen testing organization, and most security teams don't currently check for subdomain takeovers. And again, many do, and there are some great ones out there that do, but it's not a universal rule yet. Yet it's also, as of last year, and I should have pulled recent data, I haven't, I apologize, but as of last year, it was the third most popular bug class over Bugcrowd at that point in time, because it does have a heavy amount of impact. Third most popular specific, there's obviously all the unique cases as well. And so you end up in this position where there's something that people have a very well understood path to find, a very well understood path to exploit, yet it's also not being covered by the most popular tooling, and it's also in many cases not understood by a lot of vendors because of that, because they are relying on those results to guide their testing. If you don't get a pen test, you get a vulnerability assessment, there's no coverage on this. And so, or if there is, it's less understood because it's often not covered. And so, beyond that problem, both 0 days and common flaws, it's also tooling. The last year, year and a half particularly, has seen a huge rise in discovery tooling, and the hacking community has significantly improved on its ability to do discovery. And a lot of that is in a non-commercial deployment. It's open source products. So Subfinder, Amass, and Aquatone, all of those tools have really evolved in a state that allows for you to discover so much more than you did before. And there's that commercial catch-up again. I mean, they're open source tools under a different license, and although there are commercial products that are aiming to achieve the same, there's still that speed to market that some of these push out patches every few days. FFuff, that's a popular directory brute forcing tool, has an update every time I log into GitHub, and every week or two I'm looking for new features because it's continually evolving with new improved techniques and tricks that a hacker is going to bring in and use but can't be used in a commercial setting. And so that speed and time to market carries over not just in vulnerability classes but the discovery side as well, which means that if there are new tricks that are evolving in the market to discover things, you're not going to see it until it comes to that production state in existing software, which isn't by fault of those companies. It's just the nature of how those two markets work. Open source is able to move quicker because people can look at the code, they can review, and they can understand the impact before they use it, where commercial is a closed source offering that has a direct financial hit if they make a mistake. And so, those two markets are kind of designed to be pitted against each other in a way that commercial can't solve. And then I touched on this a bit before, but the digesting experience of information goes a little bit beyond that. There's other elements. So, as a hacker, I'm going to look at social sources as well. So I might look into LinkedIn and employees, and then start to look. Some common findings that you'll get is to go to an organization, pull the staff that work for an organization, and then see if they have private GitHubs and if they've published sensitive code, or if they've accidentally published internal credentials into those projects. And it's something that, although probably could be solved by software, I don't believe currently is, because we're coming back to that same scope problem. Signal to noise. As a human being, I can look at a profile and connect it back. Like I might look at someone's LinkedIn, and it might be the slug that they use that I can tie back to a GitHub handle, or it might be their name, and if it's a more generic name, I need to maybe look at cross-reference with their Twitter to know they belong to the organization. But there's a very manual process of attribution there that changes on a case-by-case basis to know that you're looking at the right thing. And you could solve that in software, but you still need a human being at the other end to cut that cut that noise down to signal. And so that creates a speed differential where a hacker is cutting usually more directly to signal because they're following that open source intelligence path and making decisions as they go. And they're also able to then pivot off that. They might see in a photo about a company offsite with a URL that's completely untethered to the domain and be able to go and follow that and find an asset that just wouldn't be found or discovered in other means. Again, same with Twitter. I mean, they might see something in the background of a photo or something in a photo to give them a coverage point to expand on that scope. And then, beyond that again, we can like acquisitions, when we refer again, like understanding and digesting of information, tying it back to scope. Acquisitions have acquisitions of acquisitions, and there's a layer of depth that often software for that same production safety reason has a very limited scope on recursion, because the further you get down that chain, the more risk you have that you're touching an asset that you shouldn't be, because business states can change, and it could be that something was sold off or not, and as a human being, you can extend beyond looking at something like Crunchbase to look at the history of a business and what domains that it tied to, using reverse who is to look at how domains used to be owned and start to make decisions to understand how the business used to be tied together, and look for assets that could be tied back, or could be sensitive from a PR standpoint, or potentially expose credentials that are still used in the current production state, or source code repositories that have information that's used in the current production state. And so tying that holistic full piece of information together does require quite a bit of ingenuity and quite a bit of depth. And so just kind of off the back of that, recommendations for that. It's essentially, it's an expectations problem largely. So I think the expectation on software today is probably over-indexed on, and people tend to attribute existing software offerings as doing a lot more than they do and not understanding the limitations. And so we're in a state where there's a lot of good offerings, but there's no single offering that I would say is completely solving the problem. Everyone's taking slightly different angles. And even in the open source space, again, there's no single product that any hunter could point to and go, I just use that. A hunter could be using anywhere from 10 to 30 to 70 tools in their toolkit to achieve what they're doing. And that's going to be in a continual state of flux and of evolution as they improve and as the products improve. And so essentially the most important thing to keep in mind is not to not use these products, but to understand where the line is, and to understand where the point is that, hey, I should probably have someone in-house, or engage a platform, or engage a hacker in some capacity to help me to map this scope and to evolve this scope, so I can continue to improve what the software is covering, but I should also be ensuring that these assets are in scope and being tested. And that trickles beyond software as well. If you're engaging in pen testing as well, you in no way should be going and just getting your primary domain tested. It's, for me personally, one of the drivers for me jumping from being a pen tester to joining the crowd was that I felt as a pen tester always being offered smaller scopes, that I wasn't really benefiting security, I was just benefiting the scope I was provided with, and that often outside of that scope, there's risks to the business that are going to be looked at. An attacker is not just going to go, oh, well, this is their main domain and that's all that's in scope. They're going to look at everything. And I think that's one of the core benefits of crowdsourced security that comes to mind. And if you're someone that prefers the pen testing, you're also going, hey, we need an open scope. We don't want to just test down this line. And then also the takeaways from that data, and once you start to receive that, is ensuring process focuses around it. Not mapping your surface area today, but ensuring that the processes you have continue to adapt around that scope. So you have a clearly defined process for acquisitions. Let's make sure that we get all of their zone files. Let's make sure we get all of the coverage that they had. Understanding the risk of what you're acquiring is important, as well as making sure that as you decommission assets, so if you have a process in place that, hey, you can't put anything on the main domain without coming through security, so it's within their remit, and it's also within their remit as it's decommissioned, because both onboarding and decommissioning assets can create risk points. And then also ensuring that things are tested before they hit production within that process and within that life cycle, that you limit the footprint of things that are done in an ad hoc fashion that likely fall outside of that testing process. And so on that, I do want to touch on, we're aiming to solve this problem as well, or at least parts of this problem, with attack surface management. So we aim to engage the crowd and use hackers to solve this problem. So in not focusing on a single hacker, but focusing on multiple hackers that approach the problem from different angles. So, as we kind of touched on, everyone has different ways and different approaches and different skill sets. Bringing multiple people together and then compiling each of the points of data that they are able to obtain into a large data set allows you to get a better coverage point than using a single individual. Much the same as crowdsourced security, you're getting multiple people of multiple skill sets attacking an asset as opposed to a single individual. It's the same problem, but from a recon focus. And so, on that note, if anyone has any questions, I think we have some pre-seeded ones as well.
Yeah, we absolutely do. Thank you for that. So before I dive in, to distill your points, it really seems as though the path to perfect security is paved in human creativity and imperfection, because hacking is inherently a creative process, and one that requires emotional intelligence. So, to give an example before I ask the question, AI can read 1 million textbooks and around psychology and tell you everything you need to know about depression in under a second. But if you were to speak to a human, they'd be able to read a face and instantly know exactly what to say. So it really speaks to the emotional intelligence that's lacking currently. So our ability to immediately react in very creative ways remains unmatched by a computer. So with that, I'd like to ask you, why do you think automation isn't ready?
So the crux of the problem essentially is that businesses aren't all the same. But if you're writing automation and you're selling automation, you have to create a baseline and you have to build around a baseline, both from a safety of exploitability and a safety of discovery standpoint. A hacker can look at, or a researcher can look at the assets and tailor the experience to what they're testing. And that has benefits both in recon and testing. So as a point of example, let's say you're running a WordPress site, and let's assume the software doesn't have a way of discovering that quickly. It creates a lot of signal trying to identify that, and a lot of testing noise where someone who's got experience in that space goes, oh, it's WordPress, I know to look in this angle and do these tests, without creating that initial noise. And so the same with recon, right? Someone can look at a business and go, oh, they use AWS, I'm going to go and look for S3 buckets that are targeted to this business, and then I'll look at Azure storage containers just to see if they used to use it. And so they can tailor the experience and really get to a deeper level in a business because of that, as opposed to software that can't solve every problem for budgetary constraints and also has to try and solve a baseline problem.
Great. So we have 2 questions that were actually submitted from the crowd in advance of today's talk. I'll get through those and I'd love to hand over to the crowd here at Local Edition. So from the crowd, forgive me if I'm not saying the alias correctly here, Loza CRG asked, where can security researchers get started in recon?
So GitHub and Twitter, the two. So essentially, the most important thing to recon, in my opinion, is getting involved in community. So it's a very, very quickly moving space. If you were extremely active in the recon space and you took a break 2 years ago, you would be like, hey, Sublister is the go-to tool for subdomain enumeration. If you asked anyone who's been active in the last 6 months even, or even a month, they'll go, oh, well, I use a mass Aquatone and Subfinder, or one of those, because they're new products that have come in that window and drastically changed the game, like completely. And I do have a bias, I was involved in the Subfinder project early on, but quite genuinely that space has completely turned on its head. Likewise, if you go back a few years, and you even if you're someone referring to course material from a few years ago, you'd be like, oh, well, directory brute forcing, I use GoBuster, and GoBuster is the only tool, or Dirbuster. Neither of those, in my opinion, and this is an opinion, and it's in no way a reflection on those authors because states change and they could jump ahead, but as of today, I genuinely feel that FFUF is by far the best tool for those things, by a very significant margin, at least in my workflow. And that, what I'm saying there, I might have a totally different opinion on that in 2 months' time, because GoBuster might come out with a new release that completely evolves it again. And so that creates this problem where there's no really a key way to go, hey, I'm going to go and watch this course or read this. So the approach I would take is to get involved in community. Twitter and GitHub are the ways you find new tooling to craft a workflow. We've got Jason Haddix here. He streams a lot of this. Stoke streams a lot of this. There's a lot of people in community today that are exposing their workflow, exposing their process, and really putting themselves out there to help people get started in recon. And that's a really great point to just follow, make notes and understand. But probably going a bit too long on this, but essentially it's about defining a workflow from a base and then using social sources to find new points and continually to evolve it.
Great. So, Twitter and GitHub are obviously complex information ecosystems. So, as an expert in recon, how do you identify the best tools to use? Obviously, there are a lot of tools out there, but how are you appraising them?
I did a webinar on the Bugcrowd channel on that recently.
Which channel?
The Bugcrowd YouTube channel. There should be a copy of it. Sorry. But to touch on the points there, essentially for me, it's a few things. Some of them are who wrote it. So there's things like if I see Tom Nom Nom wrote something, I'm immediately interested. I know that there's something to it.
Why?
So the why that someone who everything I've looked at and everything that I've seen of his work is just amazing quality, and the stuff that he writes shifts everyone's workflow.
So how are you identifying the quality?
So quality identification comes down to using it, experiencing it, and for me personally, I'm an ex-developer, so I have to look at how things are written. But even outside of that, you can look at how well are things maintained. A lot of tools are really great at point of release, but then they never evolve and they never shift. And so looking at a GitHub project, the activity, benchmark it for yourself so you can put it in the terminal and run time to see, is this faster than this? So it might be, for me personally, I have a rather elaborate subdomain discovery tool around subfinder and mass and some independent stuff. But then if I want to do something quickly, I might use a bash script or find domain. So I have one workflow for speed if I just want to sit down and get moving, and one for coverage. And all of that just comes down to testing, looking and understanding, as well as looking at what others are doing and kind of asking myself the why. If I'm watching Namasek stream, I see him do something, I can be like, oh, well, why is he doing that? What is that something I should be doing? Same as if I'm watching a Jason Haddix stream, I'm going to be asking the same questions. It's going to be, there's a reason that people hit on something. And so I need to understand that reason or ask them that reason and then see if I agree with that or if I want to evolve on that or what works for how I work.
Great. So last question before I hand over to the audience here, and this one comes again from the crowd from Pradaki054. So researchers have been tweeting a lot that they're seeing a rise in notifications about endpoint changes such as new subdomains, etc. What are your thoughts on this?
So that's a tooling evolution problem. That's the visibility on that problem was just not there before. So subdomain enumeration has really hit its stride now, and so we're getting more assets, we're getting more coverage. I mean, if we go early 2018, the general rule as a hunter was you use the Rapid7 DNS dataset with a bash command line and you wait a window and you run sublister and you do some OSINT. Where today there's DNS grep for an instance, Rapid7 pull, and a way to maintain a Rapid7 dataset and all these other tools that I touched on. And they're both faster, which allows you to do this more regularly, and they're better coverage. So where these points of change were, in my opinion, already happening before, I don't think business has shifted its approach dramatically. I think our ability to discover that shift as business does make its change has shifted and improved dramatically. And so it's, with the rise in our ability to find more signal, also comes the need to further isolate that to what we want to be testing.
Awesome. Okay, well with that I'd like to turn over to our audience here at Local Edition for a question from the crowd.
The softwares that may be good at doing that sort of fuzzing on a company.
So the question is there any tooling that's good at kind of following the threads and fuzzing in a company? It's a problem that a lot of people are trying to solve. So myself, I've explored a lot with natural language processing and Levenstein distance to look at how I can see the difference in content and follow that path. I think the problem is there's so many unique edge cases. At least personally speaking, I haven't found a way that can follow those threads accurately. And I've looked a lot at products. Part of where I'm speaking today, like I've looked at, if there was a commercial product that could do it, I'd probably buy it for my hunting. As well as looking at open source offerings. I don't think anything really does it well for the points I kind of hit on, being scope, and that you can't really create a baseline that fits all use cases. The way I think it will be solved will be in natural language processing and further understanding of those algorithms like Levenstein or potentially others that I'm not aware of to hit that point. But I don't think we're there today, and I don't think we're going to be there a year from now.
And what's another example of something wacky that you found as a hunter using these techniques?
So the question is, I have the weed example and what's some other stuff I found that's kind of wacky in that space. So one thing I want to make clear, because I know some people will watch this and think there's this common understanding of subdomain takeovers being really common and something people focus on. Look at acquisitions is in no way just a subdomain takeover problem. Some of the stuff I've found looking at acquisitions, I found wireless devices that were co-opted in an office that were with default credentials still within that network, that when I've submitted and we've got into it, it was explained to me that it was from an acquisition and an inherited problem, where in that particular example I believe it was someone in marketing set it up so they could get a better Wi-Fi coverage in their space. I've found in acquisitions again, old iDRAC controllers that were co-adopted into another company but not actually put into a maintenance cycle. So there's a lot of cases outside of subdomain takeovers that I've discovered that kind of hit outside the press impact but could have a direct impact to the business that is active today. Another example I've found would be, I found SQL injection that came via an acquisition, which was a really weird one where the database had been moved but the website hadn't been updated, and I was able to get access to production databases for the top level domain, even though I came via an acquisition. And so there's a lot of those cases, and understanding that when a company is folded into another one, sometimes the infrastructure takes a shift right, but the software doesn't, or the hardware takes a shift because the surrounding hardware shifts and there's not a full coverage point there that allows other vectors to be exploited.
Awesome. So we have time for 1 to 2 more questions. Does anyone have something that's on top of their mind that they'd like to ask?
Favorite recon tools?
So the question is, do I have a favorite recon tool or a collection of recon tools? I've developed a lot privately, so in terms of favorite, it's probably that stack, which is probably not the best answer for a takeaway. In terms of things that are out there, my favorite tool at the moment is FFuff. It's maintained by a guy in the EFF, which he's exceptionally quick at updating and very responsive to the community, which I think is a really good bar to meet. And he's done a lot of work to make the tool appropriate not just to his use case but other people's as well. So I would say that's probably my go-to outside of my own stack.
Fantastic. Okay, if we could please get a huge round of applause for Codingo here.